Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. First up today, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories has submitted a report to the United Nations Human Rights Council, concluding that the situation in Israel and the occupied territories amounts to apartheid. In a 19-page report submitted to the body on Tuesday, Michael Link said Israeli Jews and Palestinians, I quote, lived under a single regime which differentiates its distribution of rights and benefits on the basis of national and ethnic identity and which ensures the supremacy of one group over and to the detriment of the other, end quote. For more on this subject, I spoke earlier, to Abdul of People's Dispatch. Abdul, this 19-page report that has been submitted, what is the significance of this present indictment?
The main part of this report is it admits that Israel, what the policies Israel is following in the occupied territories and in 1948 historic Palestine, those policies are basically apartheid. They create a system of apartheid, a system of discrimination between Palestinians and non-Palestinians, and it creates a kind of hierarchy between these two. All the policies, the report says, which was prepared by the UN Special Human Rights Rapporteur in the occupied territories, Michael Link, basically says that all the policies followed by Israel in last 55, 60 years in the occupied territories basically are followed with the objective. The objective is to kind of create a dominance, maintain a permanent occupation on the Palestinians. So in that way, it is one of the first, you can say, reports which kind of officially recognizes that because there are many reports which have been published by international groups, human rights groups, but the UN, from a UN body, this is one of the first major interventions which can lead to the recognition of Israeli occupation as apartheid. So yeah, that is the significance of this report.
Right. Like you were mentioning, Abdul, a little while ago, that several of these reports have now been published by established human rights organizations around the world, including the likes of Amnesty International, of course, and now the UN also supporting this conclusion or coming to the same conclusion. What sort of diplomatic impact is it likely to have on the state of Israel and its policy making as with regard to its Palestinian citizens?
Well, Israel denies all these reports. When Amnesty published the report in February, they said that they even said that this is anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. And they also had a great objection on the comparison that this is similar to South African, the apartheid system in South Africa. If we know what happened in South Africa and how South African regime was isolated internationally, Israel is thinking on those lines. If this becomes a common thing, they might, the boycott and sanction movement, which is right now is informally led by the groups, Palestinian groups, will become a international movement in UN and outside it. So they are scared about it. So this report, I was just has tried to address that aspect of Israel's objection to South African regime, and it has strongly come out with the fact that it, in some, though it is not same, in some instances it is much more extreme than the apartheid regime which was there in South Africa. It says that in South Africa there were no separate highways. In South Africa there was no bombing on the civilian areas, which Israel consistently does. So in fact, you can say it is a much more stronger assertion to the larger global consensus, which if it follows its logical end, may lead to some kind of recognition of the need of international pressure on Israel to kind of follow the two-state solution, which has been adopted, accepted in the UN much long before. So that is the basic, you can say, the logical conclusion. We don't know, given the larger international politics, given the veto power which supports Israel, We don't know what will exactly happen, but if continues this way, this is going to strengthen the movement for boycott and international pressure on Israel.
Right. Thanks so much for that update, Abdul. Russia has said it's withdrawing from negotiations with Japan aimed at signing a formal World War II peace treaty because of Tokyo's tough stance against Moscow's military action in Ukraine. I quote, the Russian side, in the current conditions, does not intend to continue talks with Japan on the peace treaty, end quote, said Russia's foreign ministry in a statement issued on the 21st of March. Russia and Japan have never signed a peace treaty to formally end World War II. One of the key issues is competing claims over territorial rights to the Kuril Islands, which Tokyo calls its northern territories. Troops of the then Soviet Union seized these troops from Japan, these islands, from Japan at the end of the war, and Russia still occupies the island group. For more on these peace talks and the impact they'll have on the Indo-Pacific region, I spoke earlier to Anish of People's Dispatch. So Anish, let's start off by please giving us some historical context to these peace negotiations that have, of course, been ongoing since the end of World War II.
So what we need to understand is that in 1945, when Japan surrendered, its war with Russia, which was a separate theater in itself, did not officially end. The official end to the war came in 1956, more than 8 years after the official end to the war. And so this shows a certain, and the primary reason for that is because of the border dispute that existed. Even though Japan lost the war, it was essentially annexed and occupied by foreign powers. It did not recognize some of the Soviet annexation of territories, including the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin. And these creation of provinces there, a civilian government, a full-fledged Soviet government as well. So this created definitely issue between these two nations. At the times, Japan was also seeing Soviet Union as a problem, especially with the Korean situation that we have also spoken about quite a lot in this show. And so in many ways, Japan sees at least saw the Soviet Union throughout its existence as a sort of an ideological enemy in many ways. And post-dissolution, after Putin came to power, a lot of that acrimony, animosity at least, remained between these two countries. But in the past decade or so, we have seen a major thawing in relations. A lot of trade routes were being created, channels were being created, and through the Soviet-Japanese maritime borders. And even though the border issue remained, between 2012 and 2021, we had, I think, about dozens of meetings between, high-level meetings between the two countries to talk about a peace treaty. Now, this is something that is quite, quite a curious case, because if you look at it, all the Axis nations that lost the war had to sue for a peace treaty eventually, but that did not happen in the case of Japan. So in many ways, this shows that peace treaty, which includes reparations, but also territorial border and border changes, that still remains. And with Japan actually upping the sanctions against Russia, it shows that this is going to take even longer than what was expected to.
So Anish, like you've painted the context for us, and in the current scenario, how does this play out? Russia, of course, being a major player also in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific.
So one of the issues that we have seen, especially ever since the Ukraine situation blew up, is the fact that Japan has. It was always obviously in the US, pro-NATO camp, and it was one of the biggest allies in East Asia, obviously, for so long. But at the same time, there was a certain level of neutrality that it tried to maintain in the past decades because of very practical reasons like trade and other relations with countries that the US has issues with, like China and Russia. But when it takes such strong stance, and we are talking about some very radical changes to its foreign policy, its refugee policy, it has taken some 76 or so refugees from Ukraine, which it has never done I think it's the biggest intake of refugees in the last 3 decades. So, and
Right.
Japan is one of those countries that do not take refugees or migrants even for that matter, naturalizes people as citizens of themselves. So, in that case, you have Japan taking some very drastic steps, and which Russia saw as a very obvious way of antagonizing it, and as a way of trying to isolate, as part of the larger attempt by the United States to isolate it internationally. And so Japan trying to go into that camp so strongly definitely creates a problem in the Indo-Pacific. We are seeing flashpoints already. We've spoken about this again in the show with Taiwan and Korea already being there. This can also become another possible flashpoint in if not the near future, but in the future, of course. And it can create issues between the Pacific region, which was relatively, quite peaceful if you look at it in the last 70 years or so since the Second World War. And so in that case,
relatively stable, yeah.
Exactly, quite stable, quite peaceful region, despite all the tensions that existed. And so you have a lot of decades of diplomacy, decades of political maneuvering being undermined simply because there is this campaign to isolate Russia and to encircle Russia, and obviously in the near future also China. So this is obviously a concerning thing that we need to be worried. We have to be worried about in for anybody who covers this region, especially.
Reports of, I think, debates in Japan about a shift in their nuclear policy also a major point in this regard that is extremely worrying for the region. All right, thanks very much for that update, Anish. And finally, former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has died due to cancer, her family announced late on Wednesday night. She was 84 years old. Albright served as US President Bill Clinton's top diplomat from 1997 onwards, making her the highest-ranking woman in the history of US government. In the context of Russia's current and ongoing military operations in Ukraine, it's perhaps pertinent to mention Albright's role in US diplomacy and its impact on Europe. She persuaded Clinton to go to war with Yugoslavia over Kosovo and pushed through Senate ratification of the expansion of NATO, who by then, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, had no real military adversary. But the expansionist view that NATO has taken since then is what has led us up to this point. Prashant, how would you define Madeleine Albright's legacy?
Right. So I think Madeleine Albright's legacy needs to really be seen in the context of the post-Soviet Union, world that came about, so to speak. And if you look at how that world was shaped, there was a possibility of a different kind of world being built in some senses, at least as far as the West was concerned. Because, like you said, NATO, there was no real reason for NATO to exist. The Warsaw Pact had been dismantled. Yeah. But the path the United States chose to take was in continuation of its path. Although it gave all these slogans about democracy, freedom and all that, it was just continuing its path from the 1940s, from the earlier parts of the century towards preponderant power, which has really always been the US doctrine. Right. And so Madeleine Albright's contributions as a diplomat, both as a US ambassador to the United Nations and as Secretary of State, were very much in line with that, very much were in expansion of that. The most famous, a lot of people, of course, if you look at the mainstream obituaries, they're all about, her childhood, her escape from the Nazis, the fact that she was the first woman to rise to such a high position. Yeah. Those are the aspects being talked about, of course. But if you look at a lot of alternative media and independent media coverage, one of the first things that comes to mind is her interview where, she was one of the architects of the sanctions on Iraq before the invasion in 2003, which had a horrible impact on the humanitarian situation. And then the reporter, the correspondent, asked her that, estimates say that 500,000 Iraqi children have died because of these sanctions, and was it worth the price? And she says yes. She says it was horrible, but it was worth the price. And that was a very shocking moment of candor. In later she's expressed regret over it. She said that I should not have said that, etc., etc. But that itself is a shocking moment of candor in the sense that it reflects how US policy pretty much exactly functions. If you look at a lot of other pronouncements as well, it's evident that this is not a one-off thing, but was part of that larger trend. And For instance, I believe Colin Powell, who also died recently, who was her successor and who was equally infamous for cheerleading and basically executing the war on Iraq, once apparently expressed surprise at the fact that she had asked that what is the point of having this big army if you do not use it. And he said that he apparently said that he was shocked at this. And she's also been quoted as saying, for instance, that the United States is this unique nation. We can see farther into the future than any other country. So basically this legacy of US expansionism, US exceptionalism, both of these important points are very closely connected, because there was this notion that you build democracy, you build you forget about what people in the countries want. You build democracy on the ruins, on so-called democracy, on the ruins of countries that have been bombed, countries that have been destroyed as a result of your policies. That was very squarely in, part of her legacy. And this, it's an important thing to note, I think, that this is not Republican or Democrat in that sense, because it's interesting when you see that in terms of secretaries of state or foreign policy, there is that unanimity or that consistency that comes. So there's Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, all of them following pretty much exactly that same line of thinking, that same line of policies. Today we see Antony Blinken doing pretty much exactly the same as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, that was going to be my next question, Prashant, that Albright, of course, was a lifelong or career-long Democrat. But those lines are very blurred and bipartisan when it comes to international relations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the whole notion that, the United States had this supposed moral right to intervene anywhere in the world, forget about laws, forget about, the United Nations. We know that the war in Iraq didn't have any United Nations sanctions. It was in fact described as highly, condemned by the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan later. And we just passed the anniversary of the Iraq war. And it's important to note that this Iraq war was a direct continuation of the policies from the 90s, including the massive sanctions that were imposed, the fact that the United States continued these bombings. The same strand, the same thinking, the same policy framework is what led to, of course, Afghanistan before that, but also Libya and Syria as well, destroying West Asia, causing causing deaths and sufferings of millions of people. It was what led to the formation of ISIS, make no mistake about it, these kind of interventions. So there is this trail of destruction that US policies have led throughout. You mentioned NATO, a very important point, because the first expansion of NATO, including countries like Poland, took place under Madeleine Albright. She was a very firm believer in the idea of NATO expansionism, and successive regimes continued it. Said that Ukraine and Georgia should also be included during George Bush's regime, and these are some of the factors that lead to the crisis today. And today we see that the United States has not really learned anything, because they are continuing to do exactly the same thing. There is very little difference between Madeleine Albright and Antony Blinken when it comes to that broad arc of policies. What they were doing in Europe and what they were doing at that time, they continue to do. What they were doing to China, they were intensified. The very similar strategy when it comes to China. They have very similar strategies in Africa. They have very similar strategies in Latin America. This notion of anybody who's our friend is a Democrat, or a democratic person, and anybody who's not our friend is a dictator
or a terrorist.
Exactly. So those notions which are perfectly solidified during the careers of people like these. So I think all of this, and in recent times you had many of these figures dying. Actually, we talked about Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld. All of these people died. Nobody really answering for the crimes that were committed under their watch. All of them hailed as great statesmen, stateswomen, and no real justice for millions of people across the world. So a very unfortunate commentary on how we are located right now, but also important, I think, to remember many of these lessons, because like I said, we cannot see the 2003 Iraq war without looking at the decade that preceded that.
Absolutely.
And the suffering that it was caused when people across the world were saying there are no weapons of mass destruction. But those heavy sanctions were placed on Iraq, which even the delivery of humanitarian goods could be blocked by the United States. So this whole trail of suffering, Madeleine Albright playing a very important role in that, and like I said, this continuity in policy which doesn't seem to change at all.
And such a trend, I think, for a complete disregard of international law established many times by the same people.
Right.
All right. Thanks very much for that, Prashant. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. For more details on all of these stories, head on over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org. And also do give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.